Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So, what I'm talking about today is the fact that in the late medieval period, so we're talking about the 15th century here, so the period when a lot of the medieval treatises that we're looking at in medieval martial arts, so historical European martial arts, the medieval sources, most of the ones that we study are from the 15th and 16th centuries. I'm going to be focusing on the 15th century here for a minute. And the point I wanted to make is that the majority of what we study in those sources are so-called blousfechten, blouse fighting, but basically unarmoured fighting. But when we come to actually practice these arts, very often people mix up their idea of fighting as we're studying it, which most of it is essentially duelling, it's one-on-one fighting, unarmoured, and they confuse it with battlefield fighting or skirmishing, melee, whatever you want to call it. And they are separate things. Now, I'm not going to say that therefore the unarmoured, the duelling stuff is irrelevant somehow. It's absolutely not. It's critical that if you want to learn how to use weapons, for example swords, if you want to use these sorts of things, you have to be able to learn how to use them one-on-one in a dueling environment before you then apply that to an armoured fighting environment. And equally, many people would argue you need to learn wrestling and all of the other things you need to know for combat, which is absolutely correct. And of course, Dagger. Not enough people study the defense against Dagger and the use of knives and stuff like this, and that was critically important in this period. That weapon, the dagger, the knife, is as important as the sword, you could say, remembering that the sword is a backup weapon, it's a sidearm, just like the dagger is, and your principal weapon would usually be either a pole weapon of some kind or a missile weapon of some kind, like a bow, a crossbow, or a gun, or you might be an artillery gunner, you might have some other particular role on the battlefield. But what I really wanted to say is that for most soldiers in the 15th century, in this period that we're studying, what I'm wearing here is, for many of them, certainly for the sort of professional soldiers, so the sorts of soldiers who would have been fighting in the 100 Years' War, or the Wars of the Roses, something like this, or whatever wars you want to look at in your own areas, this would have been about the minimum level of equipment that you'd find. You'd probably find a slightly lighter level than this. So what I've got here is an arming doublet, a brigandine, and a salet on my head, or sallet as some people would like to call it, and this is probably about the minimum level that you would get most kind of professional indentured soldiers fighting in, certainly in hand-to-hand combat. So some of you might quite correctly point out that there would in fact be some soldiers who would wear even less gear than I'm wearing here. We'll talk about the gear relative to upscaling and downscaling in a second, and that is sort of true. You might find certain archers, for example, might simply be wearing a padded jack and maybe a helmet, a form of salet or some other form of skull cap that's less complete than this one is. But this nevertheless is a fairly good analogue for what a lot of soldiers were wearing in the 15th century. That is a form of arming doublet, something on the body, in this case a brigandine. Sometimes it might be a mail shirt and a brigandine, which I do have a mail shirt but I didn't put it on for this video, which would obviously be even more protective than I'm currently wearing. And obviously always head protection, and head protection is very, very important, as I bang on about in so many of my videos. In the medieval period, if you can only afford one piece of armour, it's going to be some form of helmet. Okay, so given that the lightest equipped soldiers are wearing this sort of level of get-up, they're going to have some sort of jacket on, with some level of padding to it, or at least an arming doublet of some sort. They are going to have something on the main part of their torso. Usually in the late 15th century it would be a mail shirt and a brigandine. Earlier in the 15th century it might just be a mail shirt, could even just be a padded jack, but don't underestimate how protective a many layered linen padded jack can be. They can stop arrows and sword cuts and stuff like this, and they're going to be wearing some form of head protection, regardless of what style it is or what it's made of. So the point is that fighting for even lightly armoured soldiers in the 15th century is a very different scenario than blousfechten or unarmoured fighting. If you just consider you're fighting me now, and maybe I've got a buckler or something to go with my sword. Let's just assume I'm using a sword, not a pole weapon at the moment. So if we're normally doing, you know, Messer or arming sword fighting, and my entire body is a valid target, that is a very, very different thing, because usually the critical blows that you land on someone in this type of Blossfechten tend to be thrusts to the body. Well, I'm now impervious to thrusts to the body, or blows to the head. I'm now impervious to blows to the head, unless they happen to come in below the level of my helmet. You could say thrusts. There are lots of things which are still valid. Obviously, cuts to the arm. This, incidentally, this is a really sharp sword that I test cut with, but I feel quite confident doing this because of the jacket that I'm wearing, which just shows you the difference between wearing any form of jacket that's designed for combat and not wearing a jacket. Okay, if I just had a normal sweater on, I would not be doing this with a sharp sword on my arm. Okay, so just even having a padded jacket on changes the nature of the fight entirely. And yet a lot of you go, oh, your neck's open, your face is open. In this case, yes, it is, even half my face, even if I've got the visor down. My arms and my legs are exposed. Yes, absolutely. And we have to point out, even when people wore quite a bit of armour on their top part, if they were just a common soldier, we're not talking about fully armoured, fully harnessed men-at-arms or knights here. We're just talking about common soldiery like billmen and archers and artillery gunners and stuff like this. But with this base level armour, whilst I do have some things exposed, yes, my hands might be uncovered. I might not wear gauntlets. I might just have leather gloves, or I might even just have bare hands. If I have to operate a bow, then I might not be able to wear gauntlets or gloves. And yes, my legs are vulnerable, but remember that my legs, you have to be able to get to my legs, and I can protect my legs by slipping the legs and by movement. So I can do things to you if you come down low to try and get to my legs. The fact is that wearing even this base level, this kind of light level of late 15th or mid to late 15th century level of armour for a 15th century soldier changes the fight entirely. So when you're looking at this type of martial art that we practice, and when you're looking at the Blossfechten or the unarmoured sections, bear this in mind. So one of the forms of training that we sometimes do in my club is within the framework of a sparring session or sparring evening. What we'll do is we'll have objective-based sparring, and this is, in my opinion, one of the most useful ways of actually using sparring as a learning tool for advancing your skills in martial arts. And one of the versions that we do is we sometimes assume certain levels of protection. So, for example, we assume that the person is wearing a breastplate or a helmet. So cuts to the head, don't do anything. Thrusts to the body, cuts to the body, don't do anything. And this changes the fight massively. And I think it's a really, really useful thing to do, but it's also very, very historically pertinent, should we say. It's very historically important if you're going to understand the way that these fighting arts were actually used in reality on the battlefield, on the streets, but the way that they were actually used in real combat, where armour was a factor. And armour changes so much. And you have to remember that this armour is utterly, careful not to hit my microphone, is completely impervious to cuts of any kind. You can't cut through hardened steel brigandine, you can't cut through a hardened steel helmet. And thrusts debatably can sometimes go through parts of armour or between plates of armour, and obviously into gaps, but nevertheless it means you have to be very targeted about your thrusts. And really a lot of armoured fighting, as you know, becomes about half swording and placing of the thrusts and wrestling and grappling and disarming and things like this. But you have to be specific about, you have to be thoughtful and premeditated about what you're doing to overcome that person in that level of gear. As I say, if you're fighting me, you need to now think about what your valid targets are. Yeah, my legs are vulnerable. I'm not wearing any leg armour. I might be, obviously, if I was up armoured. If I was a more well-equipped, I do have arm harness and leg harness, I could put those things on. That would make me even more invulnerable at a cost, be more fatiguing, more hot, wouldn't be able to march so easily and do various other things that easily. But clearly at the moment, even with this base level of armour, yes, there are exposed openings that you can go for, but you have to be premeditated in thinking how to get to those, and remember that your opponent knows that those are exposed things. A little word on the visor, incidentally. So a lot of people, when I do videos talking about armour, they go, oh, there's a hole, there's an exposed thing. Well, armour's all about a trade-off. It's not about encasing yourself in a giant steel ball and going, oh, now you can't hit any of me, because now you wouldn't be able to do anything that you need to do as a soldier. Remember that soldiers predominantly have a job to do. Soldiering isn't just about being impervious to an opponent's weapon. It's about marching, it's about carrying things, it's about building bridges, it's about climbing up walls, climbing over walls, digging things, entrenching, building a camp, doing all of the things that you need, capturing enemy siege engines, all of these kinds of things you need to do that require you to be mobile. Now, if we were in combat, one of the options that I have with the available equipment that I'm wearing at the moment is visor up or visor down. Now, this is only a partial visor, this is only a half visor, okay? But even if it was a full visor, that would be my choice. And I have made the argument, and I know some people agree with it 100%, and some people partially disagree with it, that in close combat, if it's not a tournament setting, in close combat in a battlefield setting, your vision and your hearing is affected as well when you close a visor, but your senses, essentially, your ability to see and hear and communicate and breathe easily, are more important most of the time in close combat than having a bit more protection here. As soon as I lower the visor, I've now limited my vision. I can't see as well, I can't hear as well, with this I can breathe as well because it only comes halfway down my face, but with a full visor I wouldn't be able to breathe as well, I wouldn't be able to communicate as well. So there is a trade-off involved with any armour, including even something as small as a visor. Okay. Finally, just as a reminder, remind you that this is a secondary weapon, and when we get into pole weapons, it does change the discussion slightly. So one of the problems with swords in an armoured context is that swords aren't very good at getting past armour. They're not heavy enough or powerful enough to sort of blast through armour or really hurt someone inside armour. You could hit me as hard as you like on the helmet with this sword and it might make me go off like that, but it's not going to put me out of action even remotely. If you did the same with a pole axe, it might lay me out flat on the ground. And really that's the point. The point is that in an armour context, armour does the job, but pole arms are much more potent than swords are, both in giving blows because you've got a lot more leverage and you've got two hands on the weapon and it's a heavier weapon. You've got all of Newtonian physics in your favour, but even in thrusts as well, it's not only a question of reach, which is what I normally talk about in a Blossfechten or unarmoured fighting context, but in an armoured fighting context you've also got the benefit of this weapon now being heavier, so impacting with more force, and being more rigid. But with large pole weapons, they are just generally bigger and beefier than swords are, and the points that you get on pole weapons such as spears or a halberd or a poleaxe or a bill or something like this just tend to be bigger, heavier, thicker, more robust spikes, and they are attached to shafts which are not going to lose energy by flexing like a sword blade will, because they're just much bigger, sturdier objects. So whether you're applying blows to an opponent or whether you're thrusting them, you can apply a lot more force to the target. And in those situations, if you want to literally just blast through armour, whether it's with an impact or whether with it's a piercing blow, you're more likely to be able to do it with a polearm. So indeed, if I was wearing this Brigandine, it has got hardened carbon steel plates inside, but you do stand a better chance of just banging a poleaxe or a spear point right into it and through it than you would do with a sword. And really, that's when we talk about half swording, which is supporting or gripping the blade halfway up. Half swording is really trying to achieve the same goal. It's essentially shortening the blade, mitigating the flex problem. So as well as having a more controlled thrust and it being better in close and more accurate maybe, and being better for grappling, there are other reasons for it, you're also supporting the blade and making it more rigid and helping to get that point through. So to conclude, really, armour changes everything. When we're doing melee games, we're assuming people are unarmed. We're assuming a street fight, street clothes, okay? When we normally do the type of sparring that you see in most HEMA clubs and you see on videos online from tournament stuff, this is absolutely what unarmoured duelling with two medieval weapons would look like. But it's not necessarily what combat with even light armour for the period, bearing in mind that the 15th century was one of probably the most heaviest armoured centuries that humanity's ever seen, probably with the 16th century tied. So even the common soldiery, be it a militia or an indentured billman or archer or whatever, crossbowman, would have a decent amount of torso protection, a decent amount of head protection, and in some cases, if they wanted to, or if they were a bit better off, if they had a bit more money to spare, they might have arm plates or mail, they might have leg armour as well. But even just with the minimum, even with the torso protection and the head protection, it changes everything about how you have to fight. You have to be more targeted, you can sustain more damage, or rather you can sustain more blows without being damaged, rather. And really polearms, as well as polearms being generally better weapons than swords anyway, swords are backup weapons, they're sidearms, they're something you can wear and carry around easily. Polearms are also vastly more potent against armour than swords are for a common person giving blows and thrusts at distance. Anyway, I hope that's been useful and interesting. Maybe I should do some more videos talking about armour as well. Give us a comment below, any feedback, ideas, observations. Please give me a like if this video has been even remotely interesting, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done already. I'll see you really soon for another video on a different topic. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.